Thanks, everybody. I know we still have some people in the hallway that are going to be working their way in here. But I'd like to introduce Mark Pruitt. Mark is not new to our group, and we appreciate that each and every time we've asked him to come and speak with us, he's been gracious enough to give us his time. He has a very unique perspective on the overall electric market in Illinois. You know, it's something that's been changing very fast. We go back a ways. We actually traded some power back when he worked for the University of Illinois, represented the state of Illinois. He then bravely took on the first directorship, I guess, I don't know if that's the word, of the Illinois Power Authority. So he was in charge of procuring all the electricity for the investor-owned customers in Illinois. And now he's an independent consultant, and he's helped many cities and counties and other bodies make their own choices. You know, obviously, we've had choice in the cooperative world for ages. We get to choose what our future is like in terms of our power supply. The investor-owned customers did not. So with that, he's going to do it from the perspective of an update from last year. I'd like to introduce Mark Pruitt from the Power Authority. Thank you so much. Bureau. That's all right. Good
You do it, man. Thanks. Well, good afternoon. This is a big week. I have a chance to come back to Springfield, and this is also the first week in the past, I had to count this up, 19 years that my wife and I have had the house to ourselves. Oldest son, son number 1, went out to college on the West Coast early. Son number 2 is at an architecture camp up in University of Michigan, and daughter is at summer camp. And you know, our minister said, hey, this is a unique opportunity for you as a couple. You need to make the most of this time together. I said, I agree. And so we made plans. We're going to go see movies and go out to eat and do all kinds of things that are not necessarily kid-centric. And on the first day, I got a text from my wife, and she said, come home early. Great. So I'm driving home, and I get another text. I pulled over to read the text, and it said, I got something for you. I'm driving faster. Get a last text as I'm driving up to the house. It said, come upstairs, it's in the bedroom, it's just for you. Wow. Go upstairs, open the door, and there's my wife. Her hair is back, and she's wearing a painting smock and has 8 cans of paint. She said, we have to do this while the kids are gone. Grab a brush. So I was real happy to come down to Springfield today. So thank you all for your invitation. It's always a pleasure to come down here. I'm going to try to give you a presentation today. See if the computer agrees. And if not, I'll talk. The power markets are a lot of fun. They're always changing, and if you're not right today, you might very well be right tomorrow. So timing is everything. What I've put up for you today is probably a facility that most of you are familiar with. It's a great, wonderful coal plant in Southern Illinois. It's new. It's one of the cleanest plants I've ever been in. It's Prairie State. I had the joy, really, a lot of fun of being there a little bit earlier this year. But when we take a look at the markets in general, we're always faced with the first question for my clients is, what's the current situation? Well, the current situation is not great. We've been in this situation where our markets, Northern Illinois, Southern Illinois, have been in a situation where we have overcapacity. This is a really busy graph, and I'm going to zero in on what really matters. When we take a look at does a market have too much supply, too little supply, we always take a look at the capacity auctions. This is the report from the the MISO capacity auction, and all the numbers aside, here's what we're interested in. What we have here are the auction results, and I'm going to just slide this down just a little. Don't get dizzy. What we have here, my arrows are just a little bit off, but we've got a situation where if you can take a look at the third line down, starting with 97,000, that's the amount of megawatts that were cleared in the auction earlier this year. If you go down 1, 2, 3 lines, there was 105,000. 105,000 was what was offered. Okay, so you have, in this instance, 8 gigawatts of excess capacity. Now, we can all be experts in our own field of electricity or natural gas, but really what it comes down to when we're talking to our residents and our constituents is, right now, we're in a situation where there is more power being offered than there are fixed buyers in the capacity market. We all went through high school, and we all know that if you have too much supply, your price drops, okay? We also have flat demand. So we have a lot of supply. We have pretty flat demand. This is just a quick graph showing the total Illinois consumption level over the past few years, going back 28 through 11. I'll update this soon, but it's going to say the same story. We haven't seen a lot of growth. We have seen a lot of loss in the industrial sector. That's been made up by some growth in the residential sector. But really, you have a lot of supply, not a lot of new load, and you also have low fuel prices. This is just a graph real quick of the futures prices for coal in the market. That bottom line, the one towards the bottom, sorry about this, folks. The bottom line is the Powder River Basin coal price per ton. And the important thing to hear is not so much the cost, it's the consistency of the price. There's not a lot of volatility in coal prices. So let's take a look at the other fuel that's making a lot of noise in the market today, which is natural gas. We take the gas price here all the way on the left border is January 2010. And we've seen that prices have dropped. That's really been a lot of the big news in the energy business for the past several years. What hasn't been such a big story recently has been the recovery of natural gas prices, particularly this spring. And we'll talk a little bit about how that feeds in. But again, nothing radical happening on the cost to generate, nothing radical happening in growth of demand. And we have a supply situation where we have more than sufficient supply. This just leads to a low price environment. Again, with the busy graphs, what you're looking at here are the futures prices for electricity. The blue line on the bottom is the price line that you see on a day-to-day basis for delivery of electricity during 2013. The red line above that is price history for securing electricity to be delivered in 2014. The green line above that is delivery in 2015. And I know they look all jaggedy here just based on the scale, but realistically, take a look at on the far left-hand side. You've got a top price of about $33.50 a megawatt hour and a bottom price of about $30. If you go all the way over to the right, 7 months later, it's not changed all that much, total dollars. So what we have here and how we advise our clients is that we're in a low price environment, which is great if you're a buyer. The thing is, the other item that we always advise our clients is that today is not forever. And to that end, we just take a look at what's coming in the next few years. And first and foremost is tighter capacity. Again, capacity is the number of megawatts the power plants within a region can generate at one point. For planning purposes, MISO, your Midwest Independent System Operator, or Mid-Continent, they changed their name, your regional transmission organization sets out a planning reserve margin that says, look, we have an expectation that we'll need X amount of capacity on our hottest day. We need to make sure we've got enough power plants to supply us on our hottest day. And then we need a little bit beyond that in case a plant is out of operation or load is greater than expected. And within MISO, the planning reserve margin has always been fairly robust, say on the left-hand side of the screen. Oh. Sorry, I'll get my buttons here. On the left-hand side of the screen, usually the planning reserve margin is somewhere around 15%. As we see in 2013, on the far left-hand side, the official capacity reserve margin for MISO was calculated at closing in on 30%. However, there's a little bit of a story there. The independent market monitor for MISO has said that's an interesting number, but we don't think it's accurate. Independent market monitor is an independent entity that takes a look at MISO's practices and tries to give them a reality check. Their reality check said this. Take a look at the blue block, the second from the left. They said you need to reduce your capacity measurements by this amount to account for getting a realistic expectation of what wind capacity and demand response capacity can really deliver into your system. That's a significant downgrade. If you go 2 over, they also suggested that MISO reduce their capacity margin calculation to account for growth in retirements within the region. And then lastly, and this is kind of important in the near term for your planning purposes, the third block, again, my apologies, folks. Problem with the third block is a fair amount of your capacity from the MISO region is being transported or moved north into PJM. Folks who own power plant capacity in southern Illinois and the surrounding region, instead of selling into the MISO market, are selling into the wholesale market to the north. They can get a better price, and we'll look at that in just a moment. When we talk about capacity and closing plants, there's a lot of talk about regulation being responsible for that. The hourly SOx and NOx emissions requirements, ash disposal requirements, water requirements, no more once-through cooling for water. There's also just the sheer economics. What we have up here is an estimate of identified plants that can't really survive in the current, of coal plants that can't survive in the current economic environment. I'd be more concerned about economic closure than I would about emissions or regulatory closures of power plants at this point, simply because the economics are more unforgiving. Folks can always get an extension on their ability to put scrubbers on a power plant. You can't get an extension on losing tens of millions of dollars in operations every year. So you have in your capacity world planned, announced, and anticipated closures of many coal plants throughout the region. To put some numbers around those dots, we went ahead and pulled the amount of known closures that are going to occur within the region. And I think this next one might be a little grainy, but just bear with me. In Illinois, we have about 800 megawatts, 823 megawatts of known capacity retirements that are coming up. Next door in Indiana, it's north of 2,400 megawatts of coal plant reductions that are coming. Missouri, Wisconsin, et cetera. These are typically coal plants that are about 50 years or older. They tend to be smaller. They tend to have a heat rate north of 12,000, and they're really only dispatching maybe 40% of the time. They're being closed or considered for closure for economic reasons. We also expect in the near term fuel cost recovery. I know a lot of people talk about shale gas and it's a miracle and it's a revolution. The reality about shale gas is that fracking is more about oil than about natural gas. Natural gas is almost a waste product of the process. The highest value is on getting a barrel of oil out of the ground when oil prices are between $90 and $100 a barrel with West Texas Intermediate Index. And as you can see, when we take a look at the number of oil and gas rigs, that the blue line shows a reduction in number of gas rigs operating in the market, even in the fracking boom. The dark line is the number of oil rigs that are operating out in the market. When we contextualize this and we say, okay, well, if fracking is going to be yielding a lot of natural gas, and it's the fuel of the future. Are we going to have enough, right? If you put all your eggs in one basket, you know, that's very risky. Well, what's the risk here? What EIA has put into this scale model is the expected growing demands for natural gas in the different sectors. Base blue, industrial, red for power, you can see a lot of growth expectation there. You see residential commercial in the green, and then exports to Mexico, LNG exports, and then pipeline losses. The dotted red line represents maximum total supply. You see that that's below what the maximum total need is, based on their projection. The implication here is that there's not enough gas to meet the demand, even with the boom in fracking. It just means that the price flexibility or the price volatility of natural gas is going to grow as we move forward. So as we depend more on natural gas and the demand for it grows, the price will also increase. Which really means, over time, you'll start to see increases in the core gas prices. And I'm just taking us back to the slide we saw earlier, and I think we're already seeing that. You know, we've seen the bottom. That was a good time. Prices were very low. But in reality, when you see escalating gas prices, based on our analysis of the MISO market, for every $1 per MMBTU increase in natural gas prices at the wholesale level, that translates into a $5 to $7 per megawatt hour increase in peak period electricity, and anywhere from $1 to $3 per megawatt hour increase in off-peak. Okay? There's a lot of sensitivity around this particular fuel. And that's why organizations such as yourselves that have the option of not putting all of your eggs in one basket are well served with your long-term planning and perhaps not buying in completely to a total natural gas portfolio. We also expect there to be some demand recovery over time. This is a really busy graph. It's from the St. Louis Fed. And it's just showing that, yeah, things were really bad a few months ago, the spike all the way down in the blue sector. Things have recovered to a point. I don't think it's been a real robust recovery. Of course, things can always change, go down or go up. But at some point, we're going to be above the line to a certain extent, and that will increase industrial demand for power. So we're looking at a lot of upward price pressures in all these categories. We talked about this a little bit earlier about exports of capacity into the PJM market. There's a reason for that. The value of capacity is usually set at the regional level through an auctions process. The blue line shows the value of capacity in MISO over the past several years. The red line shows the value of capacity in PJM over the past several years. You're looking at a, moving forward, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 6 to 1. Variance in value of capacity. So of course people who have capacity in MISO are going to try to sell into PJM if they can. They can quadruple, quintuple their value. But that means that there's less for the resident market. This is another bar graph for the MISO zone that includes Illinois. And I throw this up here just to show that exports are a significant portion of what we're looking at here. Right now, the capacity margin, reserve margin is close to 25% within this region. You're looking at somewhere around 7 to 8% of that margin being eroded simply because of exports into northern Illinois. This will eventually feed into pricing in southern Illinois. So, what does this bring about? Well, price recovery and instability. This is another busy graph, and for those of you who really don't care about stats, just bear with me for a moment, okay? Prices in the market are set through a bidding mechanism, right? And what we have here is the red line that says, here is the bidding that you would expect to see in the current market, meaning that if you have so much demand for electricity, you will yield such and such a price. For instance, if you have a demand for 20,000 megawatts of electricity, that translates into a price of about 32 bucks. okay? That's how, when we talk about pricing for electricity, it's this type of graph that usually tells us where things are. If you take the expected retirements and exported capacity out of the MISO market, what happens is that red line shifts over to the blue line. It means that your clearing price at 20,000 megawatts goes from 32 bucks to 42 bucks. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but multiplied over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of megawatt hours, it's a significant impact on pricing. It's a 25% increase, roughly. So that's why this is important. There's a lot of sensitivity in this market, and it really behooves organizations such as yourselves that when you're looking over the longer term, you have to take into account, again, today is not forever. You have to contemplate what is the world like if the wholesale market price for power increases 25% unexpectedly. So that's the market overview. Whenever I come to your organization, I always get a lot of questions about aggregation. I work with about 60 aggregation communities. The smallest community I work with is Table Grove. I think that their population is about 240 households. My largest client is City of Chicago. So Northern Illinois, Southern Illinois, large, small, we've seen it. And here's just a few quick slides as to what's going on with aggregation. Right now, over 600 communities have aggregated throughout the state. It's pretty amazing. That's all happened in the past 3 years. No other place in the country that has had aggregation has seen that amount of growth. What that translates to is about, I think ComEd has said that once all the current aggregations are moved out, about 85% of their residential load will have gone to competitive supply, up from fractions of a percent 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. It is a dramatic shift in this market. Most of these aggregations have been created to get savings against a price to compare. That's the default offer from the utility. And we're entering a new environment for the folks who have jumped into this arena. Last year, you could simply put out an RFP, not really think about it, and be able to show a 40% savings to your residents over the price to compare. And I think that that's what caused the phones to ring at some of the cooperatives saying, well, look, our people down the road are getting a discount. Where's ours, right? Well, it's pretty short-lived. This year, you're looking at the discount that's available of being 5%, maybe 20% in some outside instances. The reason for that is that the price to compare has changed. Ameren and ComEd have had the price to compare that is issued every spring, and it's good for a year. Those prices up until this year have included the cost of a certain number of swap contracts that were entered into during the rate settlement case back in 2007. Those have all rolled off, and thereby the price to compare has dropped significantly. In ComEd territory, price to compare used to be 8.8 cents. That was on May 31st. Starting on June 1st, it dropped to 5.4 cents. Okay? There were a number of communities that had entered into municipal aggregation contracts at 5.5 cents and 5.6 cents. All of a sudden, they found themselves to be above the price to compare. Oops. Also, with regard to the swaps and the IPA, the agency that schedules the purchase of electricity for the default portfolio, new purchases have been curtailed. They didn't even hold an auction last year because so many customers had moved out to the aggregations. Now, the price to compare is just much closer to the market. That being the case, you also have some challenges, particularly around capacity cost allocations. There are two ways, the two investor-owned utilities in the state calculate capacity costs different ways. In ComEd service territory, the utility allocates a certain number of dollars for every residential account. Every single-family home gets a certain amount of dollars. Those dollars get converted into price per kilowatt hour. Ameren takes a slightly different approach, and they assign a value for capacity to each account, but it's scaled according to how much electricity is used by that account. So one is volumetric, the other is flat rate. The challenge with the flat rate approach in ComEd, and we're finding this now, is that communities with smaller average consumption end up paying a higher price because they're trying to spread $120 over 7,000 kilowatt hours, as opposed to trying to spread $120 over 20,000 kilowatt hours. What that's doing is that for the city of Chicago and some of the inner ring suburbs that have smaller houses, they're looking at the possibility that they can't get a price next spring that beats the price to compare. My number is that 50% of the aggregation communities in ComEd could go back to the default rate next spring, unless this capacity issue is addressed. There's also a little bit of a challenge for some of the municipalities in that most of the aggregation communities have said they will require their suppliers to meet or beat the price to compare. If the price to compare comes out and it's lower than the contract amount, the vendor has the option of either A, reducing their market price for power and keeping the contract, or B, pushing all those customers back to the default rate. You can return to the default rate without a penalty. Okay, so it's not like it's going to cost consumers more money. They're always going to have the lowest priced option. But the challenge is that putting a meet or beat provision into your requirement for a supplier puts risks on that supplier. That supplier then responds by putting a premium into their price, which makes their price less competitive against the price to compare. So what started out as a really great story of savings, and we're going to guarantee savings, might be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of having a competitive price. And then lastly, the default portfolio. Where does this price to compare come from? Well, it comes from purchases that were scheduled by the Illinois Power Agency. Well, traditionally, the Power Agency has usually purchased firm power for discrete volumes, meaning it's not full requirements. They simply buy 50 megawatt blocks, okay? They've always allowed the utilities to balance the portfolio on the spot market. What this does is it allows the utilities to put out a price to compare at that 5.4 cents, but still have the authority to raise or lower that price by a full half penny per kilowatt hour, above or below, depending upon how they need to balance out their financial obligations for mixing the supply or meeting the supply. That means that the price to compare that a lot of these communities are trying to hit is really a moving target. And again, that further complicates the issue for aggregations. It could be that the IPA takes a decision that they're going to migrate from this fixed volume purchasing schedule to more of a full requirements. Politically, that could be difficult. They could move to more frequent procurements, which means that the price to compare might change quarterly or every 6 months, which makes decision-making a little bit more challenging for consumers. Or there might be a proposed legislative change. And really, this is where I leave off, and just a word to the wise for my friends. If they go for a legislative change, you know, lots of things can be changed. You never just open up legislation for one issue, or that might be the intent. My experience is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, usually more than one thing gets changed. And that presents a risk, right? Because there's always somebody who's got a great idea for how you could do your job better, and they're more than willing to let the legislature figure that out for you. So I just encourage you that it looks like to me the growth in aggregation is slowing, the economic benefit is reducing. You might actually see more people going back to the default rate in your investor-owned communities or communities served by investor-owned utilities. What I would caution you about is that you still need to be engaged on this and still need to be tracking the situation, because I think that there are enough forces at work here where a proposed legislative change or some type of regulatory change might be brought to bear. And you just want to make sure that that doesn't come back and affect you, because you all are doing your job, right? You're responsible to your members. You don't want this drama becoming your problem. So that's it for my comments. If there's any questions, I'm happy to respond, or I can get out of your way and let you get back to your meeting. Thank you very much.